Record. Okay, awesome. So welcome to week 17, day one. Today we are going to be talking about how to use, use effects. So a use effect is a very, very handy tool in React that lets us essentially interact with a component through some sort of an external system. So everything that we've done this week has all related to, setting props or setting states within an app, sending states from one component to another via props. You've learned, how if you can click a button to do something, then that can update your state. Or something like with relating to React components. But all the words I'm saying right now about the stuff we've covered all relate to, well, things living inside of your React environment or a limited amount of user input. The question at hand for today is, what if you need to, connect to, say, a browser DOM? Let's say that, you have some cookies stored in your browser and you need to pull those out. Or if you have data living, in your Django backend or on another server, and you need to pull that data from the backend onto the front end. Right now, using states and props on their own, we don't have a way to do this, which is where use effects come in handy. So again, use effects are a React hook that let you synchronize a component with some sort of an external system. So use effects generate what React calls side effects, which basically happen every render. So obviously, when you load up a React web page, and here we can go to app.jsx. This is from last Monday. We have an app here. It's got two components, right? If I hit F5 on the page and it loads this page up, it's not just going. It has to manually go in and say, all right, what is my component? Okay, my component is this H3. This is my custom component thing. I need to go and render my component, which essentially for our purposes right now, it copy pastes this code and replaces an instance of my component with that. So every time that your React page updates, it has to re-render, which is something that we can trigger a use effect. So let's talk about how to do that. Okay, so I'm going to go to my console. And let me just go dir. I'll change directory into demos and do another dir. Yeah. Okay. Actually, you know what? Why don't we just use app? So here, let's see, what folder is this in? Simple Vite project. Let's go there. Okay, so if I have created a React project already, can somebody remind me how I can start my React project up once I have it going? Or once I'm in the directory where it is?
You don't mean with the VS Code, right? You mean just like npm install, or is that
So
enough?
I've already created this simple Vite project. This is the thing that we created last month. So all of this stuff has, it's got components, it's got the app, it's got other things. What I want to do now is, I've got my terminal open here. How do I bring the website to life, like right now?
You
Yeah,
mean npm rundown?
Perfect. Okay, I'm glad I heard multiple people saying that and demand in chat. So yeah, let's do that real quick, right? Let's do npm run dev. All right, cool. And yeah, we'll just open this up in the browser. So yeah, this is a thing that we made last Monday, right? We have our nice big, this is my first React app. We've got our 2 custom components in there. I'll go ahead and stop running it for now. But this is the gist of our app.jsx that we made last time. So we're going to use the exact same file today. Yeah, we can keep my component.jsx. We won't play with this, won't play with that. Yeah, I'll go ahead and, So I'm just going to delete a bunch of this stuff, and we'll just say this is not my first React app. You guys have already made React apps by now. And we're going to start off with the useEffect tutorial. So in order to use useEffect, we first have to import. So what I'm going to say is I'm going to import React, and then from within that, I'm also going to import useEffect and useState. So you guys are already familiar with how to use useStates, so we won't go over that in too much detail today. But one thing to note is useEffect and useState generally goes hand in hand, and we'll see how that works. So inside, whenever we use a useEffect, let's see if there's anything useful if I mouse over this. No, not really. Okay, well, if we use a useEffect, there's a specific format that we're going to, need to use the useEffect. So here, what's a good thing we can do? Yeah, why don't we go ahead and let's make a website that has like a simple counter on it. So we've got import React, we've got those things, and we're gonna create, let's say, const, and then we're gonna just make it make a counter. So we're gonna create count and then set count. And now obviously this is just going to be the regular useState format. And I'm just gonna say that my counter is going to start at 0, right? So say this is a counter placeholder. So what I want to happen is every single second, I want this web page to update my counter once. So how can I do that? Well, the first thing is we should probably, have it return something. And we'll just say like h2, and we'll say I've rendered, and then we'll put like the number of times this component count times. So what I want to do again is I want this thing to update every little while. So this is where our useEffect is going to come in handy. Why are we going to use useEffect for this? Because remember, we rely on useEffect to interact with things outside of React. Is system time, or the time that the browser records, is that something within React? Not really. So useEffect can be used to help us take advantage. So a useEffect has a general format. So first, let me go ahead and put a semicolon there. So the first thing that we're going to input into our useEffect is, in general, it'll be blank. So we're going to just put an open and close parenthesis. However, as you see up here, useEffect is going to, generally that thing is a placeholder for some sort of effect or effect callback. We will not worry about that right now, but in probably tomorrow or Thursday, you may end up filling in, the little space between those two. But an effect callback is basically if you have something specific that's happening on your web page, like a specific event, and if your useEffect needs to use properties of that event, then that'll usually go inside of your expression there. So once we do that, we're going to use a fat arrow function, and we're going to put in a nice pair of curly brackets. So this is the first half. The second half of our useEffect is going to be the dependencies. So useEffect has useEffect can have dependencies. So number one, if you leave this dependency here blank, like just like this, useEffect only runs on the first render of your component. If you put in a blank array, if you put in a blank array, it'll run on the first render of your component and it'll never run after that. So your useEffect runs one time. If you keep it completely blank, where there's no dependencies, React will go wild. It'll run this useEffect every single render of the page. Lastly, if inside of here, you put in some props or you put in a state or something, like you put in some dependency, then useEffect will only run one on the first render, and two whenever one of your props or states change. So we're going to play around with this functionality in a little bit. But for now, I want to actually write up what goes inside of the useEffect. So inside of here is going to be useEffect dependencies, determines how often to run useEffect. Then meanwhile, inside of here is going to be the actual effect, and basically saying like, what do you need to happen? Or to make, let's say to make happen. So the thing that we need to do is, well, we want our website to update the counter, let's say every 1,000 seconds. Is there a function that I can use that lets me set how long something takes in JavaScript? If you guys don't know it, it's okay too.
I think it's like time delay or something like that.
Similar, yeah. As Damon said in chat, it's basically set timeout. So let's see if I can type this out. Yeah, so JavaScript language basics. I mean, the function itself is pretty simple. So it looks similar-ish to the useEffect in format, but basically the first statement here is a fat arrow function. Inside of that fat arrow function, you say whatever you want to happen. And then the timeout is basically just like how long you want this thing to take. So for us, let's go ahead and just define our const. Something weird fell on my keyboard. Const timeout. We'll make this 1,000, and we'll just say this will, update page every 1 second. And inside of our timeout, we want to update the count. So, let's see. Who would I like to volunteer? No. Can I just say like count equals count plus 1?
No, I think you have to use the set count thing.
Yeah. So the slightly annoying thing about using states is we can't modify them unless we use our setter function. So what we have to do is say set count, and then we'll just say, basically, I like to write it as a fat arrow function. So I'll say like count, and then this goes to, whoops, too many arrows. And then we'll just say count plus 1, and then we'll put a semicolon there, and that's it. And then we've got our timeout down here. We're not going to leave any dependencies right now, just because I want to show you guys how this works. And then we'll leave the bottom blank. So any questions about what I've coded so far? I'm also just going to tell it to, let's just say console.log count at the beginning. All right, so let's go ahead and start this up and see what happens. So open it in my browser. We see here, I mean, it looks like it's rendering it here. Let me do that one more time. So go localhost, It goes 0, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we see that it keeps rendering this guy basically every second, right? So we have 0, and then, well, we'll talk about why it skips 1 in a few minutes. But basically, I mean, you see that it's our counter sure looks like it's working. It's rendering it every single time, well, every single second. So let's go back. Let's stop this for a second. And again, that is if we have no dependency. If we have no dependencies, then this thing will basically run every single render. Now, let's say that we put in a blank array, right? If we put in a blank array, this one will only run on the first render of the web page. So we'll kick this guy back up. And we see here, it's stopped at, well, the rendered component 2 times. Why is it saying that it rendered it twice? So React has this slightly weird quirk where it'll run unless you change it, it'll generally run a useEffect twice. Like it'll, in my experience, when you're loading up a page for the first time, usually it'll do it once when everything loads in, and then next when it loads up the specific component. So that's why here it prints out 0 twice, because it's rendering that component 2 times, but it's rendering them in really quick succession. So there isn't really any time delay. So it's basically like it rendered it once, even though it actually did it twice. If you had a need to render a component only once on the first load, there are ways to do that you can look up and that I can share with you after lecture. For right now, we won't bother about that just because it's not really needed, but that may be something that's definitely something good to know for the future.
Doesn't taking strict mode off fix that in the main.jsx?
Yeah, that'll do that as well.
Okay.
Okay, sorry, something very weird just sounded like it was happening outside my door. All right, so let's go ahead and shut that off. We'll go back to here. And then the last thing that we can do is put in what dependencies we want to give our React useEffect. Obviously, the easy, simple choice is to just give it count, right? Because we want this to run every single time count updates. How many times does count update? Well, count updates, once every second, right? That's what we've told it to do. So if we run this, open browser, and we see here, it works exactly as expected. It works in basically the exact same way that this with nothing here works, just for right now. And again, the reason for that is because if we just, took this out and I hit save and we go back, let me refresh it. Again, it does the exact same behavior. Why? Because, well, this guy, remember, with nothing there in the dependencies, it runs every single render. What do we tell it to do every single render? We tell it to set the count and then wait a second, and then set the count and then wait a second. Now, if we add this dependency back in, what are we telling it to do? We're telling it set the count on the first render. It'll update it to 1. Then every single time the count changes, set the count and then wait a second. So essentially, they're doing the exact same thing for this specific example. For others, it may be different. For others, you could, let's see. Do I have any examples of this coming up? Actually, yeah, we do have some coming up. But basically, useEffects are very helpful when you're trying to do these sort of repeated tasks, repeated calls, repeated displays. That's what it's good for. And that's mostly what we're going to use it for. So are there any questions so far? Let me also, did I stop my server? No. Are there any questions so far about what useEffect is, how we structure it? Again, we have the thing you want to happen in the first part, and then the dependency variables in the second. And usually the dependency variable is blank, a blank array, props, states, even both. Any questions about this so far before we move on to something a little more advanced? Nothing?
Could you one more time? So I'm looking at count, and I feel I get it, but I don't know. The count being the dependency is throwing me off a little bit. So count. Okay, so set. Oh, okay, set timeout. I see it. I think I got it. Never mind.
Do you want to talk through it if it helps?
Yeah. So okay. So basically, you're using set timeout, and you're calling set count.
So I would recommend
Is it
thinking about it.
every-
I would recommend thinking about it from the moment the user first loads the page. So what
Okay.
happens when the user first loads the page? Like the first thing.
The use effect runs.
Right, because it always runs on the first render. So
Mhm.
what happens when it runs on the first render?
So when it runs on the first render, it increases the count.
Right, so it'll run on the first render. It'll run this entire function. It'll run whatever you told it to. So it'll set that timeout. It'll console log the count, and it'll set the count.
Mhm.
So then, okay, after the first render, here, let's see if I can get somebody else to help fill in as well. Jesus, so what happens after the first render? When does useEffect update?
Let's see, after the first render, I mean, wouldn't it just update right
But
away?
What can, or let me rephrase, what conditions need to be satisfied for useEffect to update after the first render in this specific case?
The count, no? The set count.
Yep, perfect. So going back to what we were just talking about, when the useEffect first runs, count is 0, right? Then we run the stuff on the first render immediately. Boom. Count gets set to 1. And by that time, your useEffect comes back and it says, count has changed from 0 to 1. Okay, let me run the useEffect again. And then it does the exact same thing. It, waits a full second, and then it bumps the count up from 1 to 2. When that count gets bumped from 1 to 2, ding, the dependency goes off, and useEffect is like, okay, count changed again, time to run it again, and so on. So it basically, everything kicks off from that first render. And then once it's there, it's basically whenever the thing changes, it'll run. Does that help?
So would sorry, I lost my train of thought. Let's say you were using a useEffect for something that didn't affect the use state that you have count. Like let's say there's count and there is, I don't know, just some other variable. And like you used anytime count changed, you would go do something to that other variable. Can you do that like that?
So here, I'm just gonna make like a variable called like thing.
Mhm.
So could you run me through that one more time? So you said every time count changes.
So like in the use effect, yeah. Instead of doing set count, could you do set thing and then still have it being relying on count to trigger the use effect?
Sure. I mean, let's see what happens if we do that. Right. So here we'll console.log. Let's just say like thing and then plus string. Oops. What's it? ToString. That looks right. And oh, I don't need to do ToString. We'll just do thing and then comma and then thing. So that way we're console logging both of these. So what you're saying is don't have thing as a dependency, right? Just update it on count. Is that right? And we're not updating count at all.
Correct.
Okay.
but you might need a button for count now besides the initial load.
Yeah. So let's see why that's the case. So we got this thing running, right? We'll open it up in the browser. And let's go into our inspect and let's see what's happening in our console. So, it's again because of what Philip mentioned, it's running that initial render twice, but that's okay. But take a look at what's happening. It's saying 0, which is the initial value, and then thing stays as 10, and then does the same thing again. But forget the second. It's only doing this once. It's not doing it repeatedly, right? And here's why. So count is our dependency. Now, let's talk about what happens on that first render. First render runs. useEffect, ding, it's the first render. Let me run. All right, so I'm going to wait a second. After that second is up, I'm going to console log count, that's 0. I'm going to console log thing, that's 10. And then I'm going to set the value of thing to be 12. Okay, so thing now gets set to 12. Now, when is useEffect going to update? It's exactly as Jesus said. It's only going to update when count changes. Have we changed count? Nope. So is the useEffect going to run? Nope. Which is why, if we go back here, it's stuck on saying I've rendered this component 0 times, which isn't true, but basically, it's not re-rendering anything. It's not rerunning that useEffect because we just never told it to. Does that kind of make sense?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. But you
Okay.
could tell it to via some other interactive thing on the website.
Oh yeah, and that is what we're going to spend hopefully less than the next half hour on, but probably something around there. So, because half of the fun part of useEffects is, well, using them for interactive things. And a timer is great, but it's a little bit boring.
They seem a little bit just like almost sensors, just
Yeah,
sense things and then they just do stuff,
that's a good way of thinking about it, actually. I mean, it's basically like, it's sort of like waiting for a change. It's kind of like, like waiting at a red light, and you're basically just like continually looking at the light and being like, is it green? Is it green? Is it green? Once it's green, then you're good to go. And then, you wait until, you keep driving until like a light changes again or something. I mean, not the greatest example, but something similar to that. So yeah, it's basically like a sensor that just senses, is the value same or not same? If not same, do thing. And then wait for it to change again. That's all it is. Any other questions about useEffect? Nothing?
Does having more than one thing in there that it's watching, I guess affect the order that state's rendering, I guess? Or like, can you run into situations by like trying to use a useEffect that it's going to mess with the state that you've already defined as far as like the order that it's called in?
It shouldn't. I mean, usually you want to put your useEffect after you set the state, just like in general, because it looks better and it makes more logical sense. And the useEffects also will sometimes run from the top down. I don't think you could really have a useEffect interfere with a state unless you're like setting the state to something that you don't want to set it to. But otherwise, I don't think it would.
Okay, I think I'm like a little mixed up on the like, I know on the React docs they like mention like when you define state or whatever that it's like important that it's called in the same time and like not doing conditional rendering. So I figured that useEffect might fall into like the same boat where maybe you have something watching something and it expects that like every time you set the count and then you set the time and then something else, and for some reason your useEffect triggers it in a way that you set time first instead of count, and then React blows up.
Yeah, I mean, most of the time, if React will blow up on you, it'll either say that you're re-rendering like way too much. Like if you have something that changes like every millisecond, or like worse than that, you may not want to use useEffect in that way. I don't think I've had React do something like what you're describing with me before. I'm not going to say that it isn't possible, but it just hasn't happened to me yet. All right. Any other questions?
If we're gonna cover this in a second, you don't have to say it now, but how do you use use effects?
So we will not be covering that today. Let me see. That more than likely that'll be something that you'll. Oh yeah, this will be something that you guys definitely have to cover tomorrow. So today is just meant to be an introduction to use effects. So like what we're gonna do after this is we're going to talk about how to integrate use effects with APIs and make a button that calls an API. And then your homework is going to be do something kind of similar, but ideally more interactive. Tomorrow, your homework assignment is going to be create a web app that has multiple APIs and uses use effects for that. Now, obviously, you probably don't want to have one use effect call all of your APIs. Like if you click one button, you don't want to have like 5 APIs running at the same time, probably. I mean, or maybe you do, but most of the time, like if I click a button to order popcorn, I only want to order popcorn. I don't want to order popcorn and a pizza and a water bottle and. It's kind of the same thing with use effects. So tomorrow you're probably you're gonna have to learn how to use multiple use effects. But essentially, using multiple use effects is basically just like a copy paste operation, but just make sure in general that the dependency is different. Like change it from count to like thing or something like that. But again, more details on that tomorrow. Okay, any other questions before we move on to using APIs? Nothing? Okay, great. So again, now we've talked about how to use useEffect with timeout. Let's go ahead and talk about how to use it with APIs as well. So I'm going to go back to the curriculum here. And today what we're going to do is we're going to use something called the board API. It's a relatively simple API. It literally just lets you find something to do. Calling it is super simple. I mean, it says API, you just put in /API, and then you just say /activity. And as you can see here, it gives you, an activity, gives you the type of activity, the number of people, like price, and then like accessibility, right? We can do this for another thing. Like you can say like yoga, organize a drawer, explore like the nightlife, watch a sunset, we could keep doing this. So nice simple API. Again, you put in what you put in basically API and then activity, and it spits out an activity. So let's say I want to create a website that basically does the exact same thing as board API, where you have a button, you click the button, and then I don't want all of this detail though. I just want it to give me like one activity. I'm not a programmer. I don't care about all of these like funky brackets and like quotation marks and all that. And I want it to look pretty. So that's what we're going to do right now. We're going to, by the end of tonight, write all of this code and also hopefully allow you guys to understand what all of the code up there does. So let's go ahead, clear this. We'll keep the use effect because today's all about use effects. And obviously we want to keep our return statement. So the goal again for right now, and we don't need component. The goal is going to be to create an app that shows well, a button that you can click to get your daily goal. And well, that ideally that shows your daily goal. So let's go ahead and add in some HTML placeholders. So let's go ahead and like make a nice little title. Oh, whoops, I switched keyboards there. There we go. We'll put this in like H1. I'll just say like today's goal. And then we'll just put in like a break return. Then, let's just do a break return like that. And just say like, today you will. And then we'll put stuff there. And then we'll put in, keep forgetting slash. There we go. And we'll just do one more. And then after your break returns, the user should probably have a button to click. Because we could do what we did like 2 minutes ago, but I don't think we really want to give our users a new goal every second. That sounds absolutely terrible. And what if they want to like screenshot the goal or something? That gets a little hard to do if it's updating every second. So let's go ahead and give them a nice little button that's spelled with a U. And let's see. Yeah, we'll just put a button and we can say like, click me for your goal. And that's our nice little button. Okay. So we've got our div, we've got, some H1 tags. Let's go ahead and just comment that out. Make sure first off that nothing has critically broken yet. So we'll go ahead and run the app. We'll just open it, see if we like how it looks. Yeah, I mean, this looks pretty nice, right? It's got like today's goal, and then today you will, and then you can click the button. I mean, if you mouse over it, it's got this pretty little like blue board or bluish, purplish. It looks nice border. And you can click it and you can see that it's been clicked. I mean, I think it looks pretty decent as a start. The only problem is we don't have any goals. So this is something that we need to change. So the first thing that we probably want to do is add in a placeholder for our goal. So let's go ahead and call this like daily goal. Now, let's think about how we want to program out our app. So the first thing that we're going to do up here is we're going to define our states. Then after states, I usually like to define my variables. And after that, we're going to write our useEffect. Yeah, that's about it. So let's think about it. What things do we have at play in our app? What things would we probably want to make states or variables or incorporate in our code? I'll give you a hint. One of them's right here.
There you go.
There we go. All right. So, to my one, in your opinion, and there's no right or wrong, there's a little bit of a right or wrong answer, but nothing like too bad. Would you want to make that a state or a variable, and why?
You asked me, right?
To my one, sorry.
What do you mean a
But
variable?
Devon, I can ask you after.
What do you mean a variable? Like,
Or just like, do you want to define it just by saying like const daily goal equals like blank string? Or do we want to do like const and then, the whole daily goal and then set daily goal?
okay, I think we should define it as a state because we want it to change. Right.
Okay, we could do that. And let's just set it to null. Like, just keep it, nice and blank. Cannot redeclare block scoped variable. Where am I defining this?
I think in the
Pretty sure.
variable.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, didn't realize that was doubled up. But yeah, so let's stick with keeping it as a use state for now. Right? So we've got a daily goal and a set daily goal. Okay. Are there any other things that we might want to include either in the states or the variables? Demand, any ideas? And I'll give another hint. Remember that we need to pull this data from our API somehow. So is it better to hard code the API link or keep the API link as a variable whose value we can change in case board API like goes defunct or something like that?
Variable.
Okay, yeah. So let's go ahead and make that a variable. So we can say, const and like API base link, and that will be, what was that link? I'll just copy it from here. Yeah, what's that? I'll just go ahead and put this in here. And that's about it. Well, we have one or two more. We'll get to those shortly. So let's go ahead and write up our use effect, right? So for now, we're not going to think about how many times we want it to render and all that. Let's just think about the inside. So what we want, what do we want to happen when the user clicks the button? What should happen? Like
Return activity.
Yes, that'll be like the end goal, right? So we want to like generate a goal / activity. Yeah, let's change this to save activity. And we'll just change that just so we can stay consistent. So that's like the end goal, right? Like return activity, like do something with it. But how do we get there from the user clicking the button? So essentially, I'm asking the same sort of thing as, all right, the moment the user loads the page, what do we need to happen? How can what are the steps in going from nothing to getting data from the API? Let's see, who seems around? Joyce, any idea for a couple of things we can do?
Sorry, give me a second.
All good.
We need to maybe fetch the data from the API link.
Perfect. Yes. All right. So fetch data. Well, I shouldn't capitalize that. Fetch data from API link. Right. And then once we fetch that data, we need to basically interpret / turn that data into usable stuff, and then use usable stuff to generate our goal or activity. 3-step process, just about. So let me ask you this as a class. You guys know how to use fetch in JavaScript by now. How do I write code to fetch something? Can I just like right now, just within the use effect, can I just say like fetch and then like, API base link? Or do I need to do something relating to like async or await or something like that? Anybody have any ideas?
Definitely some
Yeah.
async action.
Yeah, you need a
Okay.
async function to return the data.
Excellent. Yes. So what we're going to do is inside of our use effect, we are going to define an async function. You could define it outside of it. I'm just going to define it inside, just to keep things a little easy. So we're going to call this function, fetch data. Real simple. And as you said, this is going to be an asynchronous function. And it's not going to have any inputs because we don't need any. And we'll, have it. It'll fetch the base link. Now let's go ahead and push this. Let's backspace that. And we'll go ahead and seal her off. So is this all I need to do to fetch data within my async? Anything else? Can I just say this and be done? Okay, Ken, I see you shaking your head. What's one more thing I have to do?
I think you got to turn it into JSON.
Okay, so yeah, let's say before I turn that into a JSON, I was going more for what Damon said, which is what we need an await before we say fetch. So we're gonna say like const, I'm gonna call this API data, and this is gonna be an await for the fetch from the base link. Then comes the thing that you said, which was let's say API JSON is going to be now. I think Philip, I saw your mic on earlier as well. Can you tell me if I have to turn API data into JSON format, does that need an await as well or not?
I don't think so. I think the await waits for the promise to resolve or not, but I'm not sure off the top of my head.
Well, let's see what happens if we don't include one. And then the last thing that we need to do, obviously, is we get the data and we get the JSON. So now what I probably should do is set my daily activity, right, using our set state. We're going to do this to API JSON dot, and let me go ahead and go back to my board API, and just see the format. Yeah, activity. That's probably what we want to do. So we'll do board API JSON dot activity. And that's it. That's all we have to do in our fetch data function. So we've already interpreted that data and turned it into useful stuff inside of there, which is great. So now all we need to do is like use the usable stuff in order to generate the actual goal or activity and poof it out onto the web page. So in order to do that, first, I obviously have to run this fetch data function. After I define it, again, I'm choosing to do it inside the useEffect. You can easily define it outside it if you want to. But basically, fetch the data, and it looks like it's about it, right? So, or is there something I missed? Let's see. So right now, let's run through in our minds what would happen if I just ran the code as it is. So on the first render, it opens up, useEffect opens up, and it says, okay, I need to fetch data. I'm going to set the daily activity. I'm going to fetch that data, and it's going to pop it out on line 36 in the today you will daily activity. One sec, let me see the question. What is the advantage of using fetch await versus Axios fetch then? That is a good question, actually. I'm not sure. Let me look this up. Usually, I tend to use just regular fetch when doing stuff with React, but let me see if I can find a more definitive answer for you than I'm just used to doing this, because I'm sure each of them has their own benefits. Oh, also, one other good thing to keep in mind is when you're making calls to APIs, Axios is a lot easier to use because it's way less complicated. So here, let me see if I can send. There's a good one. So yeah, I just sent a blog link there. But if you're trying to create anything other than a GET request with fetch, it takes a while to like set, you have to put in options and headers and bodies and stuff, versus with Axios, it's a little bit easier to do the same thing. Like it looks neater. Also, Axios, I believe, is backwards compatible, whereas fetch is not always. And Axios also automatically turns things into JSON, which is kind of a nice feature. That article should have more details for you, but yeah, other than that, I'm not completely sure. Any other questions before we continue with the useEffect analysis? Okay, so this thing, like we said, is going to run every single render of the page, right? But we don't have a way to run the useEffect based off of the user input, right? I don't want a new, goal every like nanosecond. I want a new goal when I hit that goal button. So, just to make sure that it works for now, though, let's go ahead and put blank parentheses there. That way, anybody remember how often the useEffect runs if I just put blank parentheses?
I think it's just once, right?
Just the first time, exactly. So let's go ahead, make sure my code has no bugs and that it runs. So let's go back here, open this up. Yeah, let's see. Inspect. Let's go console. Okay, that's not what I was looking for. It doesn't look like it actually rendered anything. Let's see why that might have happened. So first thing I'm going to do is, right now it looks like, so Vite says the server connection was lost, which is good. Let's go ahead and make sure my API calls in the correct format. So board API activity, that looks fine. Maybe it's related to the awaits. So let's think about what happens here. So if we go into fetch data, it's an asynchronous function. What's the first thing that happens? It's going to wait to fetch the data from that base link. But line 20, API JSON, does not have an await on it, right? So API JSON is going to say right away, bam, I'm going to take API data and turn them to JSON. But API data is dependent on waiting for that fetch from the API baselink. It's not, that fetch does not happen instantly. I mean, there are some APIs where fetching data can take a long time, right? So API JSON, here, let's go ahead and let's do this. Let's go ahead and console log API JSON. So let's go ahead and say like API JSON, and then we'll put a comma and then do that. And, we'll do this up here. And why don't we console log API data as well? Nope, data. Just so you guys get to see, what's going on under the hood. So if we run this, open it up, and where is my inspect? And console. So see what happens here. I mean, the API data right now doesn't have, let's see if there's anything in the, okay, well, that's a little more complicated than I was hoping for. But I mean, the promise is returned and it says fulfilled. Gives us an activity. Interesting. So the API JSON is fine. Let's see if there's anything in here. JSON.
I think I remember. Isn't there a data object that we get back? So it'd be like API response.data or something.
Let's see. That's what I'm trying to look for right now. It's not in headers, that's for sure. It's not in URLs. It's
When it returns a promise, doesn't it need another await somewhere? Like
exactly. That's the main thing.
when
So
we're calling the function, do we need to put an await in front of it or something?
not when we're calling the function itself, but we need to put an await on line 21 we need to await the API data .json. So that goes back to what I was saying earlier about the things that we do on line 19. For API data, we're waiting for the fetch to come back. But on line 21, we're just telling API JSON, go ahead and turn this into JSON. At first, it's like, but I don't have anything to turn into JSON because I'm waiting for this thing. Then set daily activity is going to be like, I don't have any API JSON. I don't know what to do. So it's not going to render it. Now, if we go ahead and, try this again, it works. And we can see that, again, that await is the thing here. If we take a look at the API data in here, it has actual stuff in it. Like it's got, that URL and it's got like a status text of okay, 200. That's all exactly what we're looking for. Versus if I take off that await, and we rerun it, and I'll hit return. And again, we're just getting a promise, right? And why is that a promise? Because it's pending. Why is it pending? Because a promise is always going to be pending unless you have the await there. And once you have that await there, well, it's no longer pending. Everything looks good. So in conclusion, we need to have an await in order for this to work. Otherwise, it will not work. Can't we just do one await and use the same variable? Yes, but just for demonstration purposes, I prefer to have it segmented out like this just to break down the fetch. Because it also makes it easier for debugging, in my opinion. For example, if you have a problem with everything in one line, it's a little bit marginally harder to tell if the problem was in fetching from your link or turning it into JSON. Which is why I like to just have it stepped out a little bit. Why don't we need a wait for set daily activity? So we only really need the await for anything that for the things that have responses, aka the fetch, or promises. Setting daily activity is just something that sets the state. So API JSON.activity, I mean, this thing is going to be blank, right? Until this thing comes in. And set daily activity is going to be like, okay, I'll wait for this data to come in before it gets set. So that's why we don't need an await there.
Are you saying
The main
Are you saying that everything in the async function, like when it hits await, like everything just waits, like you don't need to have an await for the rest of the code, basically?
Correct. Because I mean, that would be really awful if you had to have an await every single line in the async. The only times we really use await, like 90% of our usage of await, is for something that's going to return a response or something that's going to return a promise. In this case, response is the fetch. The promise is when we turn it, is when we're awaiting it to be turned into JSON. Okay, so we're almost done with getting this thing working. The only thing that's not working is, well, here, let me spin that server up real quick. Let's just refresh it. I mean, okay, I can pot some plants, great. If I click this button, nothing happens. Why does nothing happen when I click this button? I want to have the website refresh when I click that button for the new goal. That's why I have the button there. The reason is because our useEffect dependencies, well, we just have it running on the initial render. How can we tell useEffect to run when I click that button? Well, let's hear a couple of ideas.
You need a state.
Okay, so let's go ahead. Oh, actually, no, I'm not going to do this right now. Tyler, you said we need a state. Tell me more. What sort of state are you envisioning? Is it going to be democratic or is it going to be like authoritarian?
Communist. No, I'm just kidding. Anarchist.
So what do we need this? What do we need a state for?
You need a state that's going to do something when you click your button, because you need to be able to use a state for the dependency. So
exactly,
you have to have something to watch the button. That way, the useEffect will watch the watcher of the button.
Yep. So let's come up with a name. You can say like const, and we'll just say like this button clicked, and then set button clicked, and we'll just keep it real simple. And okay, what value do we want to give our use state initially? Like when the user loads the page, do we want this button to be in a clicked state or a not clicked state?
Not.
Yeah, I mean, like let's keep it as not clicked. So now that Tyler's given us the idea, who haven't I heard from tonight? Chris, any idea for how we can incorporate something online in our button that will change the state when we click that button.
Yeah, you can trigger it with on click right in there.
So what do I do inside that on click?
You can set the goal given to true.
Okay, well, it would be goal given if we were going off of the code exactly that was on week 17, day 1. But the value that we have is set button clicked. Same principle, different name. So also remember in your on click, make sure to use fat arrow functions. It's generally a good thing to do. So we're going to, because again, inside the fat arrow, if you needed to, you could specify the event of the click as E. We don't need to do that, but I'm still setting it as a fat arrow function anyway. And we're going to set button clicked to be true. And now for the final piece of the puzzle. Corey. So we have a, set button clicked set state. We have our button click state up here. How can I tell useEffect to run when the button has been clicked?
You would need to return some kind of is clicked.
Okay, so that's sort of what we have up here.
Button, right? Okay,
Mhm.
button clicked.
So where would that go in my useEffect? Would it go in the?
Well, it could be I mean, this all happens automatically. I would think it'd be if maybe, or you're listening like an event listener in a way. You're listening for the button to be clicked.
Right. So that's kind of what our button click function does, or our button click state does, right? So what we're saying here is when I click that button, I'm going to set button clicked to be true.
Okay.
The only thing that we need to do now is link button clicked to our useEffect. So let me ask you this. Remember, our useEffect has two parts, right? We have the what do I need to do part. What do I need to do? And then down here, we have the dependencies, or the what conditions will my useEffect run for? So based on that demarcation, do you think that we should refer to button clicked in the what do I need to do section, or in the what conditions will my useEffect run
It
for
have to be in the
section?
what conditions.
Okay,
it could
right.
be the Boolean value as well, just true or false, because that's what the set button clicked is returning.
Yep. So all we need to do is copy paste button clicked into the brackets on line 31. Because what the brackets on line 31 do is they essentially act like that if else clause that you were just talking about. What the brackets say is if something inside of those brackets changes value, run the useEffect. That's all it does. So now we've set this up, we've set up our useEffect so that the useEffect will run 1 on the first render and 2 whenever button has been clicked. There's one more thing that we should probably do. And let's see, who will be my last volunteer for tonight? Harry. So Harry, when we start the page, our button clicked is going to be set to false. But when I click the button clicked gets set to true. What happens if I click that button again? Will the button state change?
I'm not sure if we have that, but it's supposed to unclick itself. And well, can I see the main page again?
Sure. So none of this, well, it matters a little bit, but not very much for our purposes. So the main thing that I'm asking is, based on the code that you see in front of you right now, which is focus on line 8 and line 42. If I click that button once, what will happen?
I mean, maybe it will stay like clicked.
Or, well, if I click the button once, what happens to my button clicked state? Because initially it's false. But if I click it once, what should happen?
It should change to true.
Okay, so it'll change to true if I click it once. What happens if I click it again, based on line 42?
I guess what you're trying to like, is there something that we need for it to go back to the default state of false?
Yes,
And how-
perfect.
and how
That
do
is
you
what
do
we're
that?
missing. That's a good question. That's what I was going to ask you.
That's what I will expect an explanation from you. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, that's all right. So
I'm not sure how to do it, but I see what you're I see what you're because yeah, it makes sense. Like it shouldn't stay, otherwise it would stay kind of like clicked and it wouldn't come back, and you don't want that.
exactly. And if it always stays clicked like that, then button clicked in here is never going to change. So that useEffect is going to run the first render. It'll run the first time you click the button, and that's it. And let's demo that right now. Let's see what happens if we actually do this. So we open in the browser. All right, cool. Learn how to beatbox. I don't want to beatbox tonight. It's 8 o'clock. Okay, I can go stargazing. Great. Clicking the button does absolutely nothing other than ruining my mouse pad. Why does that happen? It's exactly as you said, Harry. Again, when a page loads, false. The first click, true. The second click, also true. So the useEffect doesn't trigger. So what we need to do is basically say, after the button has been clicked, unclick the button. And that's what I'm going to do inside my useEffect, right? Because remember, the useEffect runs when that button has been clicked. It won't run outside of that. So what I'm going to say is, after we fetch the data and we set that daily activity, I'm going to go ahead and set the button clicked to be false. And this will reset button clicker, which will mean that useEffect can run again when clicked.
Is it like a under the hood while loop type of thing?
Yeah, basically. So that's all this dependency is, just as like I was explaining with Corey earlier. Under the hood, the dependencies are basically telling useEffect, all right, I have a list of things in here. I want you to continually check this list of things. If something in this list of things changes, run your useEffect. Otherwise, sit back, relax, don't do anything. So by adding button clicked to that list of dependencies, we're telling useEffect, or we're telling React, hey, the moment that this button clicked switches from true to false, or false to true, run the useEffect. Don't change it outside of that. And ideally, that is what should happen now. So if we click now, let's organize your movie collection, find a charity, make a bucket list, listen to a new podcast, write a list of things. That looks pretty good. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, which is not the greatest about this system, is if you look really carefully when I click, it actually reruns it twice. And there's a reason for that. It reruns the daily goal twice because we're setting our button click to be false from true, right? So what it'll do is when it's changing from true to false, it'll say, hey, button click changed. And it'll rerun the whole thing. So
Would it be
If you have
like
a list, sorry.
Go ahead.
If you have a list of dependencies, it only takes one change, like one of those dependencies to change to trigger the
yes,
rerun.
that's correct.
Cool.
Could you
Is it a bad
for it, Phil.
practice to like set the state? Like, could we have just set the initial state to 0 and then just had the count increment, and then like we know that it's gonna do one thing each time that button is clicked? Or is that like, because 0 doesn't really mean much to the button, it's not a good idea?
We can do that. Like we can say like const like num clicks, set num clicks, and we'll just set this to be a use state of 0, right? Let me put a semicolon. And then here we'll just change this from set button clicked, and we'll just say this is going to be set num clicks. And then this would be like num clicks plus 1. And then we'll just change this from button clicked to be num clicks. Let's see what happens. Tick 1, 1, 1, 1. I mean, yeah, that works. The only question is, does it make more logical sense than having a state that detects if the button is true or false? To each their own. But this avoids the issue that we had before.
Couldn't
So-
you just do set button click to the inverse of button clicked? Like exclamation point button click, so it just toggles between true and false. And it's kind of just like a
Actually-
toggle switch rather than being a true false thing.
You know, that might work as well. Here, let's try that. So we'll say set button clicked. I think you're right. Let's just say button clicked. But then, we'd probably want to change the variable name from that.
Yeah.
To like toggle button or something. But yeah, I mean that works too. Like there are multiple ways to do this. There's no right or wrong way in React. Unless your code breaks, then obviously it's the wrong way. But yeah, I mean that option works as well. So again, if we go back here, I can keep clicking this as long as I wanted to, and I'll get a new goal every single time, which, hey, that's what we wanted to do. So in conclusion, oops, don't know why my Spotify opened. Let me pause my screen so I don't have to show everybody my music tastes just yet. And okay, well, that was interesting. So in conclusion for today, we started off by talking about how to import useEffects, right? You import them just like useState from React. useEffects have two parts: the what do I need to do part and the when do I need to do it part. The what do I need to do part usually is a fat arrow function. Inside of that fat arrow function, you do stuff. And in the when do I do the stuff part, you have 3 options for dependencies. Option number 1, leave it blank. It runs every single render. Option number 2, put in a blank array. It runs on the first page render. Option number 3, put in props or states into it, and it will run whenever those props and or states update. And that's what we did here using the onClicker. We also did a quick review of fetch. So remember, whenever you're fetching data, make sure, please, to put it inside an async function, ideally fat arrow. Make sure you have an await for your fetch, and that you're awaiting your JSON interpretation of your fetch. Very important. With Axios, it's a little bit different, but there are some guides on how to do that. And that's about it for lecture this evening. Any questions? All right, gonna go ahead and